In early December 2025, within the tightly controlled inner circles of Buckingham Palace, a message reportedly circulated that broke with decades of tradition. It did not come through an official briefing. It was not released to the press. According to people familiar with the conversations, it was delivered quietly, directly, and with unmistakable weight. The message was attributed to Princess Anne. Those close to the situation say her words were brief and deliberate. The long-rumored dossier exists, and warnings had been given. That confirmation, if accurately described, landed like an earthquake among those who heard it, because for years the palace had relied on silence to contain speculation. This time, silence was no longer enough. According to sources, the confirmation followed the circulation of newly resurfaced photographs that reignited questions the royal family believed had been settled. The images, widely discussed online but never officially addressed, prompted renewed concern among senior figures responsible for security and institutional stability. Prince Harry's reaction, as described by people familiar with the aftermath, was immediate and emotional. He had long believed the warnings he heard years earlier were exaggerated, driven by prejudice or hostility. If the dossier was real, that belief would be harder to sustain. What makes this moment so consequential is not the existence of rumors. It is the suggestion that internal assessments, conducted quietly and long before any public controversy, reached conclusions that were never meant to see daylight. Conclusions that challenged the narrative of chance, romance, and coincidence. The royal family has long operated under a code of restraint. Never complain, never explain. That code is designed to protect the institution from cycles of reaction. But insiders say this situation was different because it touched on security rather than reputation. According to people who have reviewed summaries of the issue, the concern was never about image alone. It was about vetting, access, and unexplained contradictions that emerged during standard review processes, matters that are usually resolved quietly before they ever become public. The central question now being asked behind closed doors is not whether mistakes were made in hindsight. It is whether warnings were issued in real time and ignored. And to understand why Princess Anne's reported confirmation carries such weight, it is necessary to go back to where those concerns allegedly began. To a period before headlines, before titles, and before anyone imagined the consequences that would follow. The concerns reportedly trace back to the autumn of 2016, a moment when palace protocol moved quietly into motion. At that stage, there were no engagement announcements and no global attention. There was simply a new relationship involving a senior royal, which automatically triggered routine vetting procedures. According to individuals familiar with royal security processes, these reviews are not accusatory. They are preventative. Background checks are conducted to identify liabilities, contradictions, or vulnerabilities that could later create pressure points. For most relationships, the process concludes uneventfully. Sources say this review did not. What reportedly drew attention was not a single issue, but a contradiction that analysts could not reconcile. Public records and interviews painted a picture of modest means and professional struggle during certain years. At the same time, travel logs and photographic material circulating within intelligence channels suggested access to environments far beyond what that profile would normally allow. People familiar with the internal discussions say this discrepancy mattered. Intelligence assessments are built on consistency. When lifestyle indicators do not align with documented income, analysts ask questions, not about intent but about explanation. According to palace insiders, the issue was escalated beyond routine staff review and shared with senior figures responsible for oversight. This is where Princess Anne reportedly became directly involved. Known for her directness and deep familiarity with security briefings, she was said to have examined timelines, travel references, and contextual summaries rather than tabloid narratives. Those who claim knowledge of her reaction describe it as cautious but firm. The concern was not framed as scandal. It was framed as exposure. Unexplained access, especially within elite international circles, is treated by intelligence professionals as a potential vulnerability until proven otherwise. The years under review reportedly included repeated appearances in exclusive settings that operate largely by invitation. These are environments where access is curated, expenses are absorbed by hosts, and expectations are rarely written down. According to analysts, presence in such spaces often implies sponsorship, facilitati, or patronage. None of this, sources emphasize, constitutes proof of wrongdoing, but in security terms, unanswered questions are risks, and risks are documented. According to people familiar with the process, summaries were prepared and shared with a limited group. The intent was not to interfere with personal decisions. It was to ensure awareness. to flag inconsistencies before they became leverage. This is where perspectives reportedly diverged. Some viewed the concerns as theoretical, unlikely to materialize into real-world consequences. Others, including Princess Anne, are said to have taken a more conservative view. Experience teaches that vulnerabilities often remain dormant until pressure reveals them. The disagreement was never meant to be public. It was an internal difference of judgment, one side emphasizing caution, the other emphasizing trust. What happened next, according to those close to the situation, transformed that disagreement into a lasting fracture. And it unfolded during a conversation that neither side would later forget. According to people familiar with that meeting, it did not take place in a formal briefing room or with advisors present. It was described as private, direct, and unusually blunt. Princess Anne, armed with summaries prepared by security professionals, allegedly chose clarity over comfort. Those who claim knowledge of the exchange say she focused on one issue above all others: not personality, not intention, but risk. She reportedly explained that the material under review was not gossip or speculation. It was compiled through standard intelligence methods, travel correlations, financial context, photographic documentation, none of it conclusive on its own. Together, it raised questions that could not be ignored. According to sources, Anne emphasized that unexplained access is treated seriously in security assessments. When individuals appear repeatedly in elite environments without a visible means to support that access, analysts ask who facilitated it and why. The concern, as framed, was not morality, it was leverage. People familiar with the dossier say it outlined repeated exposure to circles known for cultivating relationships quietly and strategically. Access to yachts, private gatherings, and invitation-only settings where discretion is assumed and favors are rarely free. In intelligence terminology, this is described as social placement. Anne is said to have explained that social placement does not require malicious intent. It relies on opportunity, proximity, and expectation. Individuals are introduced, doors open, expenses are absorbed. Over time, familiarity replaces formality. Obligations are implied rather than stated. According to those present, she asked a question that cut through everything else: who paid for it? The question was not rhetorical. Analysts had reviewed available financial records. They did not show withdrawals or charges consistent with the level of travel and access depicted. That gap, sources say, was the core issue. When funding sources are opaque, vulnerability follows. Prince Harry's response, as described by people familiar with the conversation, was defensive. He reportedly interpreted the warning as an attack on the person he trusted most. To him, the concerns sounded like judgment rather than protection. The implication that his relationship carried security implications felt insulting. Sources say he rejected the premise outright. From his perspective, the dossier represented everything he believed was wrong with palace culture: suspicion, control, a refusal to accept happiness at face value. He reportedly dismissed the material as exaggerated, rooted in bias, and driven by fear rather than fact. That moment, according to those close to the situation, marked a turning point. Princess Anne is said to have made it clear that her responsibility was to warn, not to persuade. She reportedly stated that once awareness was given, the decision belonged to him, but the record would reflect that the warning had been issued. The dossier was not meant to resurface. It was meant to be archived, a precaution documented and set aside unless future events gave it relevance. For years it remained there, unspoken, unacknowledged publicly, a quiet footnote in internal files. What changed everything was not the past itself. It was the present, colliding with questions that had never been fully answered. As the years passed, the concerns documented in that early review did not disappear. According to people familiar with the internal record, they simply went dormant. The relationship moved forward, public narrative solidified, internal caution gave way to outward unity. But intelligence assessments are not erased by time. They are revisited when new information overlaps with old questions. Sources say that overlap began appearing gradually, not suddenly. Photographs resurfaced, travel timelines circulated again, names that once seemed inside. Dental started appearing more frequently in proximity to the same events and the same circles. Individually, none of it proved anything. Collectively, it reactivated a file that had never been closed. According to individuals familiar with the matter, one name in particular drew renewed attention. A figure described publicly as a close friend and professional contact, but viewed more analytically by security reviewers. Someone whose role involved introductions, access, and placement within elite social environments. Analysts reportedly revisited patterns associated with private membership networks that operate across continents. These are not casual clubs, they are curated spaces where influence, capital, and ambition intersect quietly. Access is selective. Relationships are transactional, even when framed as social. In that context, repeated introductions matter. People familiar with the review say the question was not whether any individual acted improperly, it was whether the same mechanisms appeared again and again, the same routes, the same facilitators, the same outcomes, patterns, not personalities. What raised concern was timing. Several of these connections intensified in the period immediately before the relationship with Prince Harry became public. Analysts noted that convergence because timing often reveals intent or preparation. According to sources, this convergence was flagged internally as noteworthy, not definitive. But in security work, definitive conclusions are rare. Risk assessment operates on probability and exposure, not certainty. As these older patterns resurfaced in discussion, they reportedly collided with present-day tensions. Public disputes, media narratives, accusations of betrayal, all of it reframed earlier warnings in a new light. People close to Princess Anne say this is what ultimately compelled her to speak internally, not to reopen old arguments, but to clarify one point that had become distorted over time. The warning had not been hypothetical. It had been specific, documented, and shared before decisions were made. From her perspective, sources say, silence now risked allowing history to be rewritten. What followed was not a public statement, but a quiet confirmation to those who needed to know. The file existed, the concerns were real, and the record reflected that they had been raised. That confirmation, according to people familiar with Prince Harry's reaction, felt like betrayal rather than protection. Years of resentment crystallized in a single realization. The warnings he dismissed had not been invented after the fact. They had been there from the beginning. This is where emotion entered the equation. Because once that realization took hold, the issue stopped being about past assessments and started being about trust. And trust, once fractured, changes how every silence is interpreted. As word of Princess Anne's internal confirmation began circulating quietly among senior circles, reactions followed a familiar divide. Publicly, nothing changed. No statements were issued, no corrections were offered. The palace maintained its practiced stillness. Privately, according to people familiar with the atmosphere, the tension was unmistakable. What stood out immediately was the absence of rebuttal. No senior royal publicly denied the existence of the dossier. No advisor challenged the premise that concerns had been raised during early vetting. Silence, in this context, carried meaning. When allegations are entirely unfounded, denials are often swift. Here, restraint prevailed. Within royal-adjacent institutions, discussion reportedly shifted tone. Security professionals revisited earlier assessments. Legal advisors examined exposure, not in terms of wrongdoing, but in terms of narrative and precedent. Once internal warnings are acknowledged, they cannot be unseen. Prince Harry's response, as described by people close to him, was raw. The confirmation reportedly felt like a personal indictment. For years, he had framed his family's concerns as retroactive justification for rejection. Learning that the warnings predated public conflict altered that understanding. Sources say he viewed the confirmation as a rewriting of history. From his perspective, it suggested that distrust existed before any public disagreement, before any interviews, before any departures. That realization reportedly intensified feelings of isolation rather than reconciliation. Among commentators and analysts who became aware of the situation indirectly, focus turned to what was not being said. No attempt was made to clarify the nature of the dossier publicly. No effort was made to contextualize the concerns as routine or inconclusive. The palace chose containment over confrontation. According to former officials familiar with institutional crisis management, this approach signals one thing: a desire to prevent escalation rather than win an argument. When silence is maintained in the face of speculation, it often reflects internal consensus that further discussion carries risk. Outside the palace, reaction was fragmented. Some observers interpreted the silence as validation. Others saw it as an attempt to avoid reigniting controversy. But nearly all agreed on one point: the issue had moved beyond rumor. The existence of internal concern, even without public detail, altered the frame. And that shift had consequences far beyond public opinion. Once the internal confirmation settled in, the consequences began to ripple outward in ways that were not immediately visible to the public. According to people familiar with institutional decision-making, the acknowledgement of prior warnings changes how every subsequent action is evaluated. Past decisions are re-examined. Present stances are hardened. For the palace, the implication was not about revisiting the past. It was about protecting the future. When internal assessments are shown to have existed before public controversy, advisors become more cautious, not less. Every response is weighed against the risk of validating speculation or contradicting the record. This is why, sources say, silence became policy rather than avoidance. Any attempt to clarify details publicly could invite demands for disclosure that the institution is neither equipped nor willing to provide. Intelligence assessments are not designed for public consumption. They are designed to inform decisions quietly. For Prince Harry, the implications were more personal. According to people close to him, the realization that concerns predated public conflict reframed his understanding of family dynamics. What he once believed to be reactionary resistance now appeared, at least internally, as preventative caution. That reframing reportedly intensified frustration rather than resolving it. If warnings were real, then his narrative of betrayal becomes more complicated. It introduces the possibility that some decisions were driven by fear of exposure rather than hostility toward him personally. Observers note that this is often the most difficult realization to process. When institutional logic collides with personal loyalty, neither side feels fully understood. One prioritizes stability, the other prioritizes trust. There are also longer-term implications for how the monarchy manages relationships moving forward. According to constitutional analysts, once an internal warning is acknowledged, it sets precedent. Future relationships may be scrutinized more aggressively. Boundaries may be drawn earlier. Discretion may give way to documentation. This shift does not require public confirmation to be effective. Institutions adapt internally long before the public notices. Policies evolve quietly, protocols tighten, access narrows. For those watching from the outside, the absence of dramatic fallout can be misleading. In reality, the most significant consequences often unfold behind closed doors, measured in changed procedures rather than headlines. What makes this moment particularly consequential is not what has been said publicly, but what has been confirmed privately. Once internal acknowledgement exists, it becomes part of the institutional memory. It shapes decisions long after the immediate controversy fades. And that leads to the question now being asked in quiet rooms rather than public forums. How does this end? As of now, the situation remains unresolved and largely unspoken in public. No official clarification has been issued regarding the nature, scope, or conclusions of the alleged dossier. No timelines have been confirmed. No documents have been released. What exists, according to people familiar with the matter, exists only within restricted channels. That absence has created a vacuum filled with questions. If the dossier was reviewed during early vetting, what specific concerns were flagged, and how were they categorized at the time? Were they treated as theoretical risk or actionable exposure? And most importantly, were any follow-up assessments conducted as circumstances evolved? There is also the question of why confirmation, even privately, occurred now. Analysts note that institutions rarely reopen old files without cause. Something must have intersected with prior assessments strongly enough to prompt internal acknowledgement. What that trigger was has not been disclosed. Observers have also pointed to the emotional dimension. According to people close to Prince Harry, the confirmation felt less like a warning and more like an indictment. It challenged the foundation of decisions he has defended publicly for years. That kind of realization does not settle easily. Another unresolved issue centers on silence. No attempt has been made to categorically deny the existence of the dossier. No effort has been taken to dismiss the concerns as unfounded or routine. Legal advisors, when asked indirectly, have reportedly declined to engage. In institutional terms, that restraint is telling. It's just a calculation that speaking carries greater risk than remaining quiet. When that calculation is made, it is usually because documentation exists that cannot be easily contextualized for public consumption. There is also the broader implication for the monarchy itself. If internal warnings are acknowledged after the fact, trust erodes not only between individuals, but between narratives. Public explanations become harder to maintain when private records tell a more complex story. What remains unknown is how much of this will ever be addressed openly. Some matters remain sealed indefinitely. Others surface gradually through indirect confirmation rather than disclosure. For now, the only certainty is uncertainty. The questions have not been answered. The file has not been closed. and the silence, intentional or not, continues to shape interpretation. Which brings the story to its most difficult point. Not what happened, but what happens next. What lingers now is not a statement or a denial, but a shift in gravity. When an institution built on silence confirms something privately, it changes how every past decision is understood. It reframes motives, it redraws lines, and it leaves fewer places to hide behind misunderstanding. For decades, the monarchy has relied on discretion as a shield. It absorbs pressure quietly and moves forward, but discretion cuts both ways. It protects and it records. When warnings are logged and later acknowledged, they become part of the institutional memory that guides future choices. For Princess Anne, sources say this was never about spectacle. It was about the record, about ensuring that history does not erase caution simply because it was inconvenient at the time. Those close to her describe a person who values duty over comfort, accuracy over approval. For Prince Harry, the implications are heavier. If the concerns existed before the public fallout, then the story he has told himself becomes harder to sustain. Not wrong, perhaps, but incomplete. And incompleteness is difficult to reconcile when identity has been built around certainty. The palace, meanwhile, appears committed to containment. No amplification, no elaboration, just distance. Institutions survive not by winning arguments, but by minimizing exposure. That strategy may frustrate observers, but it is consistent with how power preserves itself. What remains unresolved is whether this silence will hold. Files have a way of resurfacing when conditions change. Internal confirmations can become external acknowledgments through time, pressure, or necessity. History often advances not through announcements but through accumulation. Those watching closely understand that this is not an ending. It is a pause, a recalibration, a moment where private records have quietly asserted themselves over public narratives. Because once a warning is confirmed, even behind closed doors, it cannot be undone. It can only be remembered. And in institutions that measure time and generations, memory is everything.